The hardest part of planning out the Any County Portable Railroad was the locomotives. In the last video of this series, I already went into great detail about why most locomotives wouldn't really work for me, and that was trouble enough, but when I actually found something worthwhile, I had a couple of hurdles I needed to clear. See, there's a few 3D prints you can snag online for free. Well, okay, there's tons of 3D prints online, but I mean in specifically HON30. The one that caught my eye in particular was an 044 rear tank locomotive design from Niko, which uses a Sugawa 2-Coupé Super Mini chassis. On Plaza Japan, these things aren't even $30. They're not perfect, they don't have any drive rods between the main wheels, but they've got a rod for the pistons, and that gives just enough motion to satiate my desire for a good steam locomotive. And this is where the first hurdle comes into play. I don't have a 3D printer. However, at the time I was committing to this project, I was buying a locomotive or two from Dave, a channel member. One was an ON30440, and the other was a 3D printed ON30 kit of his own design that he sells. Since Dave runs a shop for 3D printing, he has a pretty good 3D printer. So I asked if he'd be willing to print a few HON30 engines for a price. A small amount of dollars for a small amount of work? Dave was not one to turn down that offer. So, he printed out the engines, shipped them to me all the way from the UK, and the day before they arrived, Niko DM'd me on Discord. Well, that's fun. I didn't realize they were a part of our community. And Niko didn't realize that her measurements for the design were off. As it happens, Niko didn't yet have one of the Sugawa Super Mini chassis. All of these designs that she had made were designed around the measurements that were available online. Now, it means that the engine worked, but it also had a pretty glaring flaw. The smoke box didn't line up with the pistons, and the engine wound up looking quite awkward. The good news is, Niko found the problem and fixed the design. The bad news is, once you have something 3D printed, you can't exactly control Z it. So, yeah, we had to print everything again. However, by this point, Niko had learned about my endeavors to build this HON30 setup and continued messaging me on Discord asking if I needed any assistance, especially now that she knew about the design flaw. Which, yeah, I did. But she also asked if I had any ideas for more locomotive designs. Which, yeah, I did. So instead of doing an 044 rear tank, today we'll be building an 042 saddle tank and an 040 tender engine, designed at my request. Since I painted the 042 first, let's start the video with her. From the very beginning of this project, I had the name Bluebell stuck in my head. I didn't know exactly what kind of engine Bluebell would wind up being, but seeing as I started with this engine, inspiration struck, and I decided to base the paint job vaguely on that name. All of the paints that I wound up using for this video, whether for Bluebell or the other locomotive, were Citadel color. To not be redundant, I'm not going to mention that every time I pull out a new paint color, so just keep that in mind. I painted the water tank with Calidor Sky, watered down a little bit so it would spread better. For the smoke box, I used Abaddon Black. I could have gone with something a little more colorful or shiny, but I liked the black as a nice contrast with the blue of the tank. I figured it helped to highlight the blue somewhat. The smoke box isn't the only thing I painted in Abaddon Black, though. I actually painted most of the engine in this color, such as the coal bunker, the cab, and the rear truck. For the roof and the ends of the engine, I used Catachin Flesh. In this case, I was trying to think a step ahead and wanted some traits between the two locomotives to be similar. This brown was a nice generic tone that added some color to the engine, but it was muted enough in tone that it would fit in with both paint jobs. Plus, on the pilot and rear of the locomotive, it makes them look like wooden boards, which were occasionally used for the ends of engines like these. Next, I painted the whistle and bell in one of my all-time favorite colors, Retributor Armor. This gave them a nice brass shine and really made them pop. For the cab windows and doors, I used WAG flesh. Yes, that's what it says on the bottle. I thought this green would make for a nice color to mix with the blue of the tank. I think it was, but I also think that it was a little bit too dark and hard to see against the black of the rest of the cab. However, it was the perfect color for the headlight. Plus, I think the green blending in has kind of grown on me. The blue is supposed to be the major focus of the engine is named Blue Bell after all, and having the green blend in a little bit helps to prevent it from distracting you from the blue. Now, one problem with these prints is the cab. While the main locomotive shell is designed for the mechanism, in order to help get a variety of these locomotives designed fairly quickly, Niko has a standard set of cabs for all locomotives. This allows Niko to not have to build a new cab every time, and it allows people to pick and choose whatever cab they want for their locomotive. However, each engine has a slightly different motor placement, and in some cases, the motor clips into the front cab wall. Since these cabs are of a universal design, you have to trim them yourself to get everything to fit. When I had to do it, it was a little scary, since the material I was cutting into was resin, and resin 3D prints can be a bit fragile. However, I managed to get the cuts without damaging the rest of the cab, and the motor fit in just fine. When it came to securing the mechanism, I tried gluing it on with some canopy glue, and that really wasn't strong enough to do the job. So I came back with some super glue and attached the mechanism that way. I also used super glue to attach the cab, headlight, and whistle. The whistle was especially annoying, since with the cab in place, it was hard to hold upright on the steam dome. Eventually, I threw in the towel and moved the whistle to the roof of the cab instead. Some older designs of locomotives had their steam domes in the cab itself, and only had a sand dome visible on the tank or the boiler, and I just said to myself that that's what's happened here. The unfortunate side effect of putting the whistle on the roof is that when I had to put on the couplers, I accidentally snapped off the whistle by applying too much pressure to the roof. At the time I'm recording this script, I haven't really bothered to fix it. I've got other more pressing issues right now. It shouldn't be too hard to fix though, as I've got a couple of spare whistles that I can paint up and put in place. I just have to actually get around to doing it. I didn't record gluing on the couplers, but all I did was glued on some pre-assembled Microtrains short shank universal coupler boxes. With couplers in them, of course. You wanna know something really annoying? Right after I got this photo, specifically for this video, I accidentally dropped this engine on the floor, and you'll never guess what broke. The front coupler. Fortunately, we still have a little time left before the trip, so I can just ask my father to grab a coupler or two from the train store, but for the finishing touches, I added a few gold highlights to various features of the locomotive. The headlight, the coal bunker rim, the cab windowsill, etc. For the trailing truck, I just popped in a metal wheel set, and with that, Bluebell was good to go. But before we explore her, we've got another engine to do first. The tender engine was a lot of the same steps, though with different color choices. I did the boiler in Abaddon Black, for instance, and the smoke box in Grey Knight's Steel. I used some Retributor armor for the boiler bands, though I actually messed this up a few times and had to repaint some of the boiler black on occasion. As before, I also used this on the bell, whistle, and the rim of the tender. Since this locomotive didn't have as much color on the boiler or the tender, I figured a bright color on the cab windows and doors wouldn't hurt. So, I grabbed Mephiston Red for the task. I figured this would make for a nice bit of contrast. I also added a touch of red to the tender water cap just to help highlight that detail. I'm not exactly sure why, but this is just something I seem to do a lot. Once again, for the roof, pilot, and rear of the engine, I pulled out Catachan flesh to help add some mild similarities between the two engines. The headlight I painted black, with the base of the headlight red, and the whistle I actually glued onto the steam dome this time. With the cab in place, in fact. Heh, much easier to explain something twice in one go, eh? The only problem with this engine is, I don't know what I should call it. Give me some ideas in the comments. We need a name for the sister to Bluebell. Now, I would end the video here. These are the two locomotives, right? But there's a couple of problems. First of all, this video is a little shorter than I'd like, and second of all, these engines actually do have a couple of problems. Problems that are going to dramatically change this project. The mechanisms are so lightweight that they don't really get track power all that well, and they're not that consistent. Plus, because they're designed for such low voltage, these suckers move fast.
I think it hit the box, but that's hilarious.
So fast that if they don't pull themselves off the track, they're gonna pull something else off the rails. Obviously, I don't want that happening. I don't want a train falling on the floor because I ran it a little too fast. So, there are two ways that I'm going to be combating this. First of all, radius. The Tomix track that I'm using has a minimum radius of 5.5 inches, and while all the locomotives can handle it, and so can the freight cars, that doesn't mean they like handling it. The Tomix track is just going to have to take a backseat. I'm sure I'll find another use for it, maybe ON18, maybe 009, but it's not for the Annie County Railroad. Before I did YouTube though, N-Scale was my go-to, and I have a ton of N-Scale Kato Unitrack. The one downside of Unitrack is the switches are way bigger, and so it's going to be a lot harder to fit in a fun, compact setup in a box. But the curve radius selection that I have in Unitrack is pretty solid. So instead of using 5.5 inch radius, we'll be using 8.5 inch radius moving forwards. Unfortunately, even with this broader radius, the locomotives need a lot of power to consistently run. Only having 4 wheels to pick up power from and having such little weight on their wheels to hold them to the rails makes them hard to consistently run. These engines are perfectly functional, but I'd like to have a backup in case something goes awry. Because with the constraints that I have, Lord knows something's going to go wrong. The solution for this can get pretty complicated, so I'm going to try and go with something fairly straightforward. A bigger engine. A couple of days before this first video in the Annie County Portable Railroad series went live, someone posted a bunch of eBay listings for HON30 locomotives. These were mostly way too expensive. The cheapest engines were about $200, and the most expensive ones were, $1,000? As a full-time YouTuber, that's not exactly something I can afford. But there were 2 engines in these listings that were actually pretty reasonably priced. Well, okay, relatively reasonably priced. I might have gone into a little bit of debt here. The first one was a trench engine, or I should say a trench engine look-alike. It had the shell of a trench engine, but the mechanism wasn't a 460 or a 262. So, a trench engine at home, I guess? That one was only $50, so it was easy enough to convince myself to snag it. The other engine, however, was a little more expensive, coming in at $150. I told you I was putting myself into debt. It was a pretty good-looking 280, though missing its smokestack. However, the missing smokestack is pretty easy to fix, and that seems to be the only issue with the engine. I say seems to be because it's not the engine I got. I bought it, but it's not the one that arrived. The guy messed up my order and sent me the other 280 that he had listed. Now, this engine had one massive problem and one minor problem. The minor problem, it didn't have a coupler on the rear. That was easy enough to fix. However, the major problem, the cab was too big. The proportions are just off. That's in part because it's too long, but that is also in part because it's not really a cab as much as it is a scratch-built shack that somebody used as a cab. However, this engine nearly handled 5.5-inch radius. The only reason it didn't handle 5.5-inch radius out of the box is because the tender shell clipped into the cab, and I already didn't like the length of the cab. I already wanted to shorten it down. But it wasn't my engine just yet. I got the wrong engine after all. So I messaged the guy telling him about the predicament, and then I also added in, you know what, I'm fine with keeping this engine if you don't want to have to deal with shipping. After a few hours of waiting, he responded, asking for a photo of the engine just to know that it was actually here, and after confirming that it was, he said, you know what, sure thing, you can keep her. And as soon as he said those magical words, I got to work. Let's get the most important thing out of the way first. Trimming the cab. This was pretty easy to do, as I just had to score the cab with a knife a bunch of times, and eventually I got to cut all the way through and remove the end of the wall. However, I realized it was probably smarter to remove the cab and then do the cuts away from the rest of the engine. So I did that before finishing the job. Sadly, I cut too deep and applied a little too much pressure on the right-hand side of the cab, and broke off more than I meant to, but it was nothing a little bit of superglue couldn't fix. So I touched up the cuts with Abaddon Black, and got to work adding color to the rest of the engine. The first quote-unquote real color I added was Retributor Armor to a couple of parts of the engine. The whistle, the bell, and I started adding some brass bands to the boiler, but I quickly realized that they didn't quite feel appropriate for the kind of engine I wanted. So I repainted them with Abaddon Black after a bit. The next color I used is becoming a quick favorite of mine, Iron Warriors. It's a nice graphite-ish gray with a little bit of shine to it, and it worked excellently on this locomotive on the smoke box, the tender trucks, and the ends of the pistons, among a couple of other places. Once again, I tried to match the other engines somewhat by using Catachan Flesh as a nice brown wood color on the pilot and the cab roof. The roof was already brown, but it was a different shade of brown, so I changed it regardless. For the pilot, I only did the beam and not the cowcatcher. For the cowcatcher, I used Iron Warriors. I thought this combination would just add a little more visual depth to the most visually complex engine that I have in my fleet. The next color I pulled out was Lubrical Green. I'd personally call this more of a dark teal than a green personally, but whatever the case, I thought it would make for a nice highlight color. I added some to the top of the tender water tank, a stripe on the valve gear, and some outlining on the windows of the cab. Once again, this color might be a bit too dark, like with Bluebell, but it was more intentional here. I kinda like the mostly black and dark vibe that this engine has. For the cab trim, I added some more Catachan Flesh, and I used a little more flesh for the edge of the coal bunker. That is certainly a quote to use out of context, huh? And for a few finishing touches, I added some Retributor armor to the grab irons and the bars connecting the pilot to the smoke box. And presto! These are the 3 engines that I plan to take with me. Ironically, with how well the 280 has been running, I might not use Bluebell or the 040 all that often. They are adorable locomotives, don't get me wrong, but I actually think they would work better on a layout with larger curves, ironically. Whatever does wind up happening though, this is a great start to our little fleet. Though, please give me name ideas for the 040 and 280. I cannot survive without nicknames. Please. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to see more projects like these. Cheers, folks.